Okay, here's the fourth pattern of gender bias. We call it the tug of war. As you can see, it was the least common. 55% of our informants reported it. It's when gender bias against women fuels conflict among women. Now, one thing to recognize is that it doesn't always happen. In our survey of women scientists, 75% of the women, these were mostly professors, said that women in my environment typically support other women. And you can see this came through in the interviews as well. The older women faculty members are always very encouraging, very helpful, and very kind to me. And that does exist, although it's interesting, Black women were far less likely to report that women typically supported each other. Only 56% of Black women did, as compared with about 77% of the other groups of women. Here's where the problems come in. One woman said, opportunities for women here are very zero-sum. So if one woman gets a prized position, another woman won't. And so it breeds a sense of competition. What the studies show is that women who have, let me go back one slide. Here, this is often talked about as the problem of the evil queen bee who is intent on keeping other women down. But this really does not stem from the personality problem of an individual woman. Instead, it stems from gender bias in the environment. It stems from the fact that there's only one woman's slot. The studies show that women who have encountered discrimination early in their careers tend to distance themselves from other women. Marissa Mayer, the now CEO of Yahoo, famously said when she was working at Google, I'm not a girl at Google, I'm a geek at Google. And you notice how she's distancing herself from the out-group, girl, and identifying herself with the in-group, geek. This is also called queen bee, but it is not. This is just, again, not evidence of a personality problem. It's evidence of a woman who is operating within a political environment that she thoroughly understands, and she understands that it's in her best interest to distance herself from other women. Prove it again bias is often passed through. Here's a quote from the Double Jeopardy study. Sometimes it's other women who are harder on other women. Well, I had to fight my way to the top. You need to do that too on your own attitude. You notice here the other women, often older women, feel like they had to prove themselves over and over again. And if I had to do it, you had to do it. That's one dynamic. The other is, I'm just toughening you up because that's what it takes to succeed here as a woman. Both of them translate into prove it again bias that's passed through from woman on woman, because the older women had to prove themselves over and over again. They're making the younger women do so. Office housework is sometimes passed through as well. I feel that female leaders can be as bad as a male leader in terms of gender bias. Her female boss expected her to edit her grant, a secretarial job, and I'm sure that she will not ask men to do that. So here is a older woman again, woman boss, asking her female colleagues to do office housework, but not her male colleagues. Tightrope bias also is passed through sometimes from women to women. I call these the fights between the femmes and the tomboys. Here's a younger woman faulting older women for being too masculine. I see lots of senior women behave that way, not only working long hours, but even adopting male mannerisms and being really aggressive. Here is a younger woman saying, it's important to me to be more feminine than the older women. I'm on kind of a backlash mission. I wear dresses, I bake cookies for my group meetings, I bring my child to class with me. I'm not going to compete as a boy because I'm not a boy, she said. And as these quotes indicate, there's often a generational conflict. Women my age in our 50s and 60s came up at a time in many traditionally male careers when women, the only way to survive was to assimilate into what the men were doing, and that's what we did. We also probably felt more comfortable with that in the first place. That's why we stuck ourselves out there as often solos in these traditionally male careers. On the other hand, women who are 20 or 30 years younger often feel very differently. They feel more comfortable with femininity from the beginning, and they also see it as part of equality, to be able to be who they see themselves as being and yet be expected in the world. That's what I always say to the older women, is this generation gap, that's success. A broader range of women are now entering these traditionally masculine careers, but sometimes this devolves into older women saying to the younger women, what do you expect with that little girl voice? You're never going to make it. And the younger women saying to the older women, you just turned into men. I don't want your life. That's a classic example of the tug of war. It's important to recognize that maternal wall bias sometimes plays out as conflicts among women. And here's an example. This is from a woman without children. People immediately assume that because I don't have children, that I should be the person who takes our colloquium guest every Thursday when we have a colloquium to dinner, because they all have their wives and their great husbands and their children to go back to. One study found that women without children work the longest hours of unpaid overtime of any group in today's workplace. And that's because often women without children are seen as having no lives. That's actually a different form of gender bias. Men without children often are seen as bachelors who are playing the field, so they need time to date and to do that. But this is a late date carryover of the spinster stereotype. And it's very important when we talk about maternal wall bias to recognize that the bias surrounding whether or not you have children affects women without children as well as women with them. And finally, the tug of war also plays out sometimes between professionals and their admins. This is from the Double Jeopardy report. Again, there's an expectation from female staff that female supervisors will be more nurturing, will be more understanding, for example, if they have to leave because of their families. Staff are less tolerant of women who are not like that. I think that often causes problems between female staff and female supervisors. We have persistent reports of women, particularly women of color, finding it more difficult to get support from support staff than their male colleagues. Some of this is female support staff expecting female professionals to do a lot more of what sociologists call emotion work, of asking them about their kids and asking them about how they feel about certain things. Sometimes it's simply that support staff looks around and sees who is on top of the organization. It's men. And so in that context, it makes more sense for an admin to hitch her star to a man than it does to a woman. And this dynamic sometimes takes on an ugly racial dynamic. Said one Latina scientist, there is this Mexican woman telling them what to do, so she definitely felt that there was a gendered racial dynamic here. Okay, here are some strategies if you encounter the tug of war. First of all, it's important to recognize the limits of sisterhood. After all, do men always support men? Of course they don't. That doesn't prove they're bitches. It just proves they're ambitious. And our expectation that women will always selflessly support other women itself is a form of tightrope bias that often expect that women will always be selfish. You know, women are often selfless, but they're also human, and sometimes they're ambitious, and that limits their ability to bond with other women or their desire to do so in a specific situation. On the other hand, if you have somebody who is undercutting you in an environment, it's very important to draw the line in the sand. And in the What Works for Women book, we have given you a very specific formulation for how to do this. This was actually quoted from the general counsel of one of the largest corporations in America. There was a woman who was undercutting her, and she called the woman into her office, or stopped in the other woman's office, I'm not sure, and just said, you know, if I have done anything to offend you, I would really like to hear about it, because I feel like we haven't always gotten off on the best foot. And my intention is always to support you. And so I would, if there's something I've inadvertently done that sends the wrong message, please let's talk about it now. She never had another problem with that woman. Very important to draw a line in the sand, but very important to do it just like that. And before you do that, read the book Difficult Conversations. What this informant did is basically use the formula from Difficult Conversations, although I think she's so politically savvy, she probably just did it on instinct. For senior women, it's very important to remember that younger women's experience is simply different. It's very important for women my age to realize that the women who are in these jobs, these highly competitive jobs, who are now in their 50s or 60s, are a very specific part of the continuum. Thank goodness, a much broader range of women is now in these jobs, which means that the younger women simply are not going to want to do it often the way the older women did it. On the other hand, junior women, hey folks, it's really important for you to recognize that senior women may not be helping you as much as you think they should be, because they may not have as much power as you think they have. One of the things that I expected when I began the interviews for What Works for Women at Work was I assumed that the women who I interviewed, all of whom were very successful women, would report that gender bias muted as they got more senior. But you know what? They didn't. Some forms often muted, but some forms did not. They never muted. Not only did the what a bitch problems increase, but even prove it again. Women reported having to prove themselves even when they were absolutely at the top of their games, in the top of their fields. They reported having to prove themselves over and over again. So the senior women may not have the political capital that you assume they have. If there are very vivid dynamics among the women, in your department, one strategy is to get women working together with other women, and not just on women's issues, because if it's on women's issues, then the Marissa Meyers won't participate. But often what can work is, you know, go spend a day at Habitat for Humanity, or figure out some project that can begin to forge unfreighted relationships among the women. This is all in the What Works for Women at Work book. But one of the things I want to point out before I'm eager to hear from you is that all of this is about what women can do for themselves. This is a self-help book. But the solution is not for women to be navigating through subtle forms of gender bias. Organizations really need to begin to redesign their basic organizational systems to interrupt these patterns of gender bias. They need to stop using systems that end women up with these huge loads of office housework. They need to run meetings so that women aren't constantly interrupted. They need to be monitoring performance evaluations and rank and tenure files so that women aren't derailed by the what a bitch problem or by gender bias in student evaluations. So the Double Jeopardy study has the first comprehensive listing of these, what I call them, bias interrupters. They're ways of redesigning the basic organizational systems to interrupt bias. And to the extent that I am, my audience includes women or men too, who are in a position to begin to interrupt these biases at an organizational level, I would really urge you to take a look in the back of the Double Jeopardy report and think about implementing one or more or all of those bias interrupters. This is brought to you by the Tools for Change in STEM grant by it was an advanced grant, National Science Foundation. Of course, all of the opinions are mine, not those of NSF, but there are a lot of other tools in Tools for Change in STEM. There's something like 9 or 12 videos of workshops. This is one, but there are workshops for search committees, workshops for deans. I really urge you to check out Tools for Change in STEM and urge your friends to do so as well. And finally, if there's anybody at the organizational level, again, this is the kind of content that the Center for Work-Life Law provides organizations through the Women's Leadership Edge program. We would love to hear from you if you think your organization might be interested in joining